Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to attend today's webinar. I'm Becca Davis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Home Repair. Today, we're going to be learning about building and nurturing volunteer communities. And I'm really excited about this webinar. If you just joined, welcome. Please introduce yourself in the chat box, share where you're located, what your job title is, and then also whether you have local volunteers or camp model volunteers who stay overnight or both. So today's webinar is going to be a bit of a watch party. I anticipate it's only going to take about an hour, not the hour and 15 minutes that I had originally anticipated. So for those of you who planned on it going a little bit longer, I should be able to give you back a little bit of that time. I'm excited about this because it's a really great webinar from one of our partners, and I had a chance to attend it live last week. So Sterling Volunteers is a great organization that offers discounted background checks for our coalition members and a lot of other nonprofits, but they're actually a lot more than that. They really pride themselves on being a thought leader in just nonprofit volunteer spaces. And so they spend a lot of time and money to do a lot of research on volunteerism, and at least once a year they have a really well-developed webinar. And so we are going to be watching just part of their webinar. So sometimes a webinar takes like 20 minutes to get to the meat of what you really wanted to hear. Well, the good news for you is that I've already watched it and I've cut out all of that, and we're going to go right to the heart of the webinar. So we are going to watch about 30 minutes of what was originally an hour-long webinar, and I'm going to pause it 2 or 3 times during that, and that way we'll have a chance to talk together about what we're watching, talk about how we can apply it specifically to home repair organizations. And so yeah, I'm excited to share all of this with you. Let's see. While I get this going, I will share some links in the chat box a little bit later at the end, but just want to make sure that you all know how to access those discounted background check Sterling Volunteers if you haven't yet. Let's see here. All right, hopefully y'all can see my screen okay. So Sterling Volunteers put together this really wonderful webinar for us, and they actually did not lead it themselves, but they hired a really wonderful person. We've actually watched some webinars with her before. Beth Steinhorn is who you'll hear speaking, and she's with VQ Volunteer Strategies, and I'll make sure you have access to her contact information later as well. But she really dives into some excellent principles of community and how they apply to volunteerism. And so we're going to watch together for a bit of it. And I encourage you all to, in the spirit of a true watch party, to drop any comments or thoughts that you have in the chat box as we go along here. And let's see, I'm just going to cue it up right at the beginning where I wanted to start for you. And great, here we go.
Maybe you already implement and others that you've yet to implement. I want to dive into the core part of our webinar today, which is looking at 7 principles of community. These are presented by Charles Vogel in his book, The Art of Community, which is a great, quick, and wonderful read. But what we've done here is take them and apply them to volunteer engagement. So the book is more theoretical and about work environment in general, work and social environments, but this we're really going to be unpacking these as they relate to volunteer engagement. So what are these 7 principles? There's boundary, which is the line between members and non-members. So in our case, that's the line between volunteers and those who aren't yet volunteers. Initiation, which are the activities that mark a new member. Rituals, the things we do that have meaning. The space where the places we set aside to find our community, those could be virtual or physical. Stories, what is it that we share that allows others and ourselves to know our values? Symbols, the things that represent ideas that are important to us. And leadership and growth, the path to growth as we participate. As I mentioned, I'm going to be sharing how these manifest or can be manifest in volunteer engagement, but I want to note that for a community to be effective and high functioning, you don't necessarily need all 7 of these. It's you really need, I'd say, a critical mass, let's say, of these elements, and it's really up to you to determine which ones make the most sense for your organization's mission, for your location, and for your community. Let's start with boundary. Boundary, that line that designates members from non-members in a community, volunteers from those who aren't yet volunteering. Members want to know who's in the community and who shares their values. Members, when we think about communities, visitors to a community, so in terms of volunteer engagement, those might be, we consider those people who want to stick their toe in the water and find out what volunteering with your organization might be like. So these folks want to know what a safe way is to explore without necessarily committing themselves. And when there are novices or newbies, they want to know at what point they've really joined the community. So when it comes to volunteer engagement, again, that's about knowing when you've made it through the application and screening process and are a truly vetted and placed volunteer. Maybe there are ways for visitors, so to speak, to try out volunteering in a lower commitment way, like through a day of service or a short-term episodic opportunity. But at the point that people are a truly accepted member of the volunteer community, it's helpful to know that and understand that. With that said, it's also really important to note that this boundary should be much more about making the inside space safe for insiders than about keeping outsiders out. So this isn't a fortress wall, this is a boundary. It's imperative, though, that boundaries be protected or guided by community values as opposed to personal preferences or petty concerns or whimsical criteria. So for example, who are your gatekeepers for volunteer engagement at your organization? Is it a volunteer engagement professional or department? Is it the organizational, your staff members, or is it an auxiliary or a council? And are those organizations and processes manifesting in a way that lives out and demonstrates the values of your organization? In a world where we are, I think very fortunately, much more aware of barriers, often inadvertent, to engaging and to making our volunteer opportunities accessible to diverse audiences and to people with different abilities and backgrounds. It's more important than ever that we think about our processes and ensure that they are objective and that they are as inclusive as we want them to be. And that includes ensuring we understand who are the quote unquote gatekeepers, who can open that door and keep it open to make sure that our processes and our access to volunteering is truly in line with our values. We need to clarify our processes so it's clear what the application process is, the selection criteria, and that we're creating space for new volunteers. That might include having conversations with veteran volunteers about leaving space for others. And finally, how do you identify a newbie who has been actually, or how do we identify members of the community, new or veteran members, through badges, through swag, etc. So here are a couple examples of how boundaries have kind of manifest themselves. We have opportunity to sign up for online apps like we see with Dress for Success. We have online communities. We have virtual information sessions. Dress for Success, like so many other organizations, quickly in April of 2020 shifted all of their meet and greets from their in-person at their boutique to online and virtual meet and greets. That was Dress for Success Western Massachusetts. We see private Facebook pages like American Red Cross of Colorado we see here. We have info sessions that can be virtual like so many organizations have done. In terms of these online communities, which also relate to space, private spaces, and designated for volunteers to connect with each other. Social media can be really effective in building and nurturing online communities. Volunteers can share and see new opportunities. They can pose questions. We know of a lot of, for example, animal welfare organizations, animal shelters, and rescue organizations that have private Facebook pages where volunteers can ask questions about fostering, announce incoming trucks of puppies, or sign up to take action steps in times of emergency, like hurricanes or fires, etc. And yet there need to be prescribed behaviors and expectations. Best Friends Animal Society, for example, described its Facebook page with this description: this group has been created for Best Friends volunteers to share information with one another and to receive updates as to recent activities of Best Friends volunteer efforts. Please join us, but we do ask that you read the rules for this group prior to posting. So it's, again, important to talk about the values and set shared expectations.
I'm going to pause it here, and I'm curious what you all were thinking as we watched about boundaries, and I'm wondering if anyone would like to share about boundaries that your organization has between non-volunteers or potential volunteers, and then when somebody actually comes on board and joins your volunteer community, either as a one-time volunteer or maybe for a mission trip sort of situation. What does your organization do to help distinguish the difference between the outsiders and the insiders? You can type in the chat box, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and share. Well, you're thinking about whether or not you want to share something verbally. I think one of the most important things is to make that boundary very easy to cross. And I know that the slide showed about volunteer applications, and somebody might decide that they want to volunteer. They click through to your volunteer application, and then they get through and it's like the 3rd page and the 100th question. They're like, you know what, this seems like more trouble than it's worth. And can go ahead and stay on my side of the boundary where I'm not going to be a volunteer. So I think it's really important to make sure that that boundary is easy for people to cross. That's a really welcoming space. Let's see, Carson, thanks for sharing in the chat box. You mentioned that you have t-shirts for your local volunteers. That's great. That helps them feel a part of the club, a part of the group, and it's easy to just visually see who's one of your organization. Does anybody else have something they want to share about boundaries for your organization's volunteers? Frank?
Yes, we have the waivers that you sign on our Rebuilding Together Day. We'll have anywhere from 30 to, we've had as many as 185. And they sign the waiver, and then they go over to the table where the people are working and they get the shirt that they, of course, that fits them. We insist that they wear them. If it's a cold, rainy day, we still want them to have the shirt hanging from the back pocket. We want them to have that shirt with them so that I go from house to house that day and talk and do the FaceTime and all that, and make sure everything's going okay. But I want everyone to have a shirt, and that just signifies that they've signed the waiver, and that means they're covered by our insurance. If you're standing there without your t-shirt, I don't know if you signed up or not. I don't know everybody that comes along. But we have different boundaries. We have no smoking on our sites. I don't care if the homeowner smokes or not. Don't stand there smoking a cigarette. It's a bad image. And different things like that. I've never had to tell someone to watch their language. It's just, we get a bunch of good people, it seems like. And that's what we do. We just make it's the shirts. It's the main thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Frank. It sounds like the waiver is also the important boundary. If you haven't signed the waiver, you're not a volunteer. Once you sign that waiver, you're in.
Right.
And wear the shirt to show that. Great. Anybody else want to share something? Okay, well, we'll continue on. We're going to watch the next 2 sections, which are about initiation and rituals, and then I will pause it for a little more discussion. But
all of that has to do with setting these boundaries. The second characteristic, the second principle is initiation. And initiation is any activity that's understood as official recognition and welcome into the community. The initiation helps members understand clearly who's part of the community, and it marks the completed journey over that boundary and into that inner ring, so to speak. I know that sometimes that word initiation is rather loaded and perhaps might connote some not so productive types of rituals, but really initiation is simply, as I stated, a marking of the completed journey over that boundary. So it can be simply welcoming new volunteers, say through a welcome video by your CEO or by other volunteers, online orientations or online trainings. Again, welcomes from leadership that could be, and volunteers. It could be virtual, it could be a video, it could be in person, it could be a phone call. Integrating into new teams and ensuring that the teams know who their new member is and spend some time getting to know them and giving them a chance to get to know the more experienced members of the team. And it also could involve credentials. The beginning of the pandemic, volunteers who were serving City Harvest in New York City during the height of the lockdown regulations were issued a letter that gave them the credential saying they were an essential worker volunteering to provide meals for people who were food insecure during that time, so that if any officials stopped them in the street, they could show this and say, I'm on my way to volunteer, or I'm on my way home from volunteering. So credentials are really important. Also, understanding the impact of work is so important. Having a meaningful event has been shown to help transition new and inexperienced volunteers to becoming skilled, effective, and emotionally involved volunteers. A 2008 study called Volunteer Stages and Transitions shows that these transitions happen when volunteers have a meaningful event, such as knowing that they made a significant difference for the people being served by the organization, being part of a staff meeting, completing training, and again, having meaningful opportunity to see how their personal actions are making a difference. You might be wondering, how do we do all of this with virtual? Well, certainly we've had 2 years to really refine that, and many of you were probably doing this before. But let's think about how we can identify volunteers who might be working exclusively virtually. Do they get an organizational email address, a t-shirt or an ID to wear while they're on camera? Do they get a listing in newsletters? Maybe a coffee mug to use on camera? Do they get a welcome on your website or volunteer portal with a picture and a little about the volunteer section? The importance is thinking about this initiation, because once members of a community, once volunteers kind of go through that initiation and cross over that boundary, they're insiders who gain new privileges and are valued for having crossed over and joined. They have nothing more to prove and are more confident and welcome and belonging. Third is ritual. What is a ritual? Well, it is really something very simple, and I've touched on some of them. It's simply any practice that marks a time or event as special or important. The actions are imbued with meaning. They connect the present with things in the past and also tie us to our hope for the future. What are the rituals that have been missing during COVID-19, or that you've had to adapt if you've been conscious of those missing things? I know early on when we were working with, again, a museum, this museum was stating that the volunteers really missed their morning huddles, their chance to connect with each other before they began their shift, whether it was in collections or out on the floor or in the shop. One way to recognize a ritual is to ask whether removing the activity would make the time feel less important. Ask yourself, what rituals have been missing and how can we adapt them to be able to maintain or nurture this sense of community? Think as well about what were the ritual triggers. What are the ritual ritual triggers, that's our new tongue twister for the day. You can say that 10 times fast, that have traditionally been involved in your organization. Maybe it's reaching a certain tenure as a volunteer, completing a training status, finishing up a project, gaining a new title, or some other type of event that's worth marking meaningfully. And you can create new rituals to do that. Very easy to create a ritual. It's simply any sort of prescribed activity that has an opening with a welcome, maybe a setting of intention, reference a tradition, and an explanation of the event. There's a body of activities where maybe someone shares wisdom or invites participation, passing something around, hanging something up for display, writing something, decorating something. Maybe there are gestures involved. And then there's a closing. You acknowledge what's been happened, what's occurred, and a sending off with thank yous. Lots of different rituals have been developed especially over the last 2 years, and innovated. Early on, there's a Special Olympics chapter that posted new videos every day. Write down a word, and the first 50 get a prize, and volunteers can participate. It was something that was done ritually every single day and could be counted upon to reconnect with the community that so many volunteers were missing. At a marine mammal center that we know, the volunteer crews met over Zoom during their regular shift, even when they weren't on duty, because the population in the animal hospital was so much lower during the pandemic. Ultimately, the question is, what are these triggers, and what normally happens, and how can we transfer this so that both volunteers who might be working virtually or on hiatus can connect with those who are on site? Not too difficult to do rituals over technology as well. Even now, even as so many volunteers are coming back on site, and for many organizations they never left, food pantries and other kind of essential services that were being done on site have continued. But it's really easy to create some rituals over technology. If we're starting, say, a Zoom meeting, you can set up the activities about telling them what we're going to do, why we're doing it, have some sort of opening activity like a check-in game, like share your rose, bud, and thorn of the week. A rose was something beautiful that happened. A bud is something that is promising, or a thorn, I think you can probably interpret that one, something that might have been a pain in your side this week. There are lots of other games as well that you can do as part of your ritual activity. And of course, closing with an activity, an ending appreciation, a question that people can weigh in with via chat, one thing I will do, one thing I learned, one aha moment. Those are all things that can help create some regularity and connect people. The fourth principle is
All right, we're going to pause there. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on both initiation and rituals. As I was thinking through volunteer initiations, I was thinking about how important it is to make sure that that first experience that a volunteer has with your organization is a really great one, so that they're going to want to come back and stay a part of that insiders club. So an example I was thinking of is when I worked at Appalachia Service Project, we served, a lot of families with home repairs, and most of the time the family was there at home. You could interact with them, but occasionally, there was a family who wasn't present. Either they were away at work, or maybe the house was in a condition where they had to stay somewhere else where you worked on it. And we would help them either way. But whenever I had a new volunteer group, I tried to match their skills with a project that needed work that had a resident home, somebody who they could connect with, because I knew that if they were able to form a relationship with the person that they were working on their home, that they would have a better experience. They're more likely to want to come back. And so for me, that was a really important part of their initiation as a new volunteer, is realizing that relational connection is so important. What else do your organizations do as an initiation for your new volunteers? Let's see, Philip said they've had to adjust volunteer appreciation events and gatherings. He agrees that those yearly events and group activities are so important to creating a sense of community and purpose. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else want to share about any initiation activities you have, any new groups that start, or new individuals? how about rituals? I bet that you all have a lot of different rituals for your volunteers. Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, our first project in 2007, there was a young lady that was helping out. She was, I don't know what her job was, but anyway, she was there, and the next door neighbor's dog, little scruffy looking thing, about a foot and a half high, was just barking, barking, barking. So she reached her hand through the fence to pet him, and boy, he nailed her. And so now every time, we always have a safety meeting on before we start our projects on Rebuilding Together Day. Everybody gathers around, and I have to tell them different things. And one of the things I have to tell them is don't pet the neighbor's dog. We have the homeowners that we're working for, their dogs are off site. They have to be gone somewhere. Cats will go hide, but dogs, and I don't care if it's a little scruffy thing, if you're in their territory, they are liable to bite you. So we don't want that. So we took care of that. And now I have to tell them the safety issues. And we have posters that we put up on every project, and it's just a reminder of safety, safety, safety. No one under 14 on a ladder. No one under 18 runs saws, different things like that. We have to go through it just for their protection and for ours. You know.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of our organizations have some sort of safety meeting as a part of the initiation. That's just so important. I would love to hear about rituals that your organizations have. I think it is probably a lot easier to incorporate rituals into the camp model volunteers who are with you for a week at a time or a long weekend. I know a lot of organizations have, a weekly picnic or a closing event where everybody takes a turn going around the circle and sharing about what was meaningful to them for that week. When I worked at Appalachia Service Project, we had a ritual at the end of a week. The staff would provide some sort of token to each volunteer as a reminder of the week. It's usually something very small, very inexpensive, but extremely meaningful. So it might have been a puzzle that had the same number of pieces as everyone who was there, and they each got a puzzle piece to take home, and it was on a necklace, and that would remind them they were a part of something bigger. And when I was a volunteer for ASP, when I was in high school, I got little trinkets like that. Often it was a piece of hardware, and I still have them 15 years later in a little box. And so I'm curious what other rituals you all do with your volunteers. Kim, you want to share?
Yes, on our ramp projects, we have signs that say, ramp built by Hope Builders volunteers. And so we have everyone who worked on it sign it. And then when we attach it and we take our group photo with that. So I think the volunteers really appreciate being kind of signing off that they helped build that. And that kind of sign is mounted there for posterity.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else want to share a ritual that they have?
This is Deb from Good Works. So one of our rituals is when we complete a home, we have a home dedication ceremony. And so we have the homeowners invite their family and their friends. We often have a cake or something, and we have a plaque that we present to them that they can hang in their home to remind them what was done. And then we have just a little ceremony where the homeowner gets to share what happened, but then the volunteers get to share as well of how it impacted them working on the homeowner's home. So it's a fun time. Everybody looks forward to that.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share a ritual? See, Adrian noted in the chat box, she thought that being mindful of virtual volunteers was important. Sometimes virtual folks can feel disconnected, and that's very true. I imagine that most of you have in-person volunteers because it's hard to repair a home virtually, but hopefully you have opportunities to plug in volunteers in other ways too, whether it's in the office or organizing stuff in the warehouse or maybe helping with your social media pages, but it's important to make sure that they feel like a part of that insider group as well. Great. Well, we're going to watch next two sections. I think it is here.
Space. Space is simply, or as Vogel calls it, temple, but I use the word space. It's really a place where people with shared value can enact their community's rituals. Any space can be made special in this way by members gathering there and telling their stories, enacting their their rituals. It's a place that should be comfortable, where inside knowledge allows the people to experience being together and be satisfied and even have some fun. So again, how can we do this over Zoom and when we have hybrid communities? In terms of Zoom, we can create backgrounds. I know one organization that started every meeting with their volunteers and training with a picture of their volunteer door, the door into the volunteer check-in and lounge area, as a way to say, yep, we're still here for you, and we're still comfortable. You could have virtual sign-ins. You could, I invite you to share other ideas for this that may have worked for your organization in the Q&A in the chat. It's really important to think about, especially as we're reconvening, we've had to adapt a lot of spaces for outdoor gatherings, and how can we make those spaces special and comfortable for volunteers as we try to regather safely and comfortably for everyone. Maybe it's a picture of your sign. Maybe it's having some familiar things from the office, creating a space where you can ensure volunteers know that they're welcome and comfortable, whether it's online or virtual. Stories are the fifth principle. Sharing stories deepens a community's connections. Stories are how members, future members, and outsiders learn the values of the community and the value of being in that community. Stories are the most powerful way that we humans learn, and every community, like every person, is full of stories. Sharing certain stories deepens a community's connections. If people don't know or can't learn their stories, they don't know or understand your community, and they don't know who you are, what you do, or how what you do matters. So stories need to be shared so that members can understand the community's authentic values and identity. So when do we tell stories in our volunteer engagement world? Well, in orientations, we communicate the origin story of our organization, right? How did our organization begin? What's the community that we serve? Why did we serve it? And how do we serve it? Orientation stories also share values. They do this more effectively than a mission or value statement ever can. So how are your volunteers learning and sharing their stories? Orientations are one way, but impact stories are another. I was thrilled to see so many different comments earlier on about newsletters. Newsletters are a great way to share impact stories back to the volunteers who are involved in driving those impacts, but we also want to make sure we share those stories with others in our larger community, leadership, community members, funders, and even the people being served by our or with our organizations. And of course, convenings are a great way to share stories. Do we give enough space to our newbies in our volunteer community to share their stories, or do we just give space to our veterans who have a lot of wisdom to share, but sometimes really could benefit from hearing stories of the new volunteers and what brings them to your organization? Valuing new volunteers as much as we value veteran volunteers, certainly in different ways, is a way to knit together the community in a really impactful and productive way. I'll turn back for an example with this example, I'll turn back to Dress for Success Western Massachusetts, which very quickly in 2020 pivoted to not only move some of their in-person events to virtual, but also recognized that it was more pressing than ever to create a digital literacy program for their participants because their program participants really needed to be able to, more than ever, create an online presence, be able to apply for and interview for jobs online, etc. And one of the ways that they told the story of that impact back to volunteers and to donors was through a thank you letter. And I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it if you'll bear with me. Because of your contribution, and it went to both volunteers and donors, so it depended on the type of contribution, but in support of our digital literacy program, I was able to deliver laptops to 2 women in transitional housing. In addition to the laptops, we also assigned them a volunteer digital literacy coach to help them achieve their goals. One of the women does not speak English as her first language, and we were able to recruit a bilingual coach. She didn't have a computer, so she can now set up an email with her donated laptop and start working on her resume and a job search. The other woman's computer broke. With her new laptop, she is working with one of our coaches to build a website selling t-shirts that she designs to help support her through college. So again, telling these stories shares impact, shares connection, and helps volunteers and those who support the organization know that their work has meaning because of these stories and demonstrating the values that they share.
Okay, we're going to pause there again. So I'm curious about spaces. Do you all have any particular spaces for your volunteers? Obviously, a lot of your volunteers work on the work site, and the space is the family's home, so you don't have a lot of control over that. But does anyone have a space at your office, or do anything to set up a special space to help volunteers feel welcome when they're serving with your organization?
At Rebuilding Together of Greater Charlotte, we have a workshop space attached to our office. It's called Innovation Alley. We share it with 2 other nonprofit organizations. But if we're not doing projects that are on the job site at people's homes, that's usually where it's held. So we've built desks there, hanging planter boxes, little free pantries. So that's really a space that our volunteers are welcome to and really enjoy.
Great, thanks for sharing. When I was at Appalachia Service Project, we would rent schools to use for the summer, and our volunteers would sleep overnight in the school building. And so there was not a lot that we could change. We had to leave the posters on the wall, couldn't touch the desk, that kind of thing, if they were pushed up against the side to make room for sleeping bags. But one ritual that we had that also has to do with space is that the staff would choose their favorite quotes about service or giving or just uplifting inspirational quotes and handwrite them and post them all over the school and the bathroom stalls and pretty much everywhere. And that was kind of a way to turn the space from a school into an ASP summer center. Does anybody else have something they would like to share about volunteer spaces? Okay, how about stories? We all know that stories are so important for donors to help them to give funds, but how intentional are we about sharing stories within our volunteer community? I'm curious if anybody has a newsletter specifically for volunteers, or if you have any intentional ways that you create space and time for volunteers to share their stories with each other.
Our board, Rebuilding Together Muscatine County, is all volunteers. And so the meeting, the first meeting after our Rebuilding Together Day, which is the end of April, we go around the table and I want to know what went right, what went wrong, and what can we do better. And then when we get that done, then I ask them for some pertinent, some learning that they had that day, some connection that they made with another volunteer or with a homeowner, or in some of the stories that come out there really surprised me. But it's kind of a wrap up. We were asking volunteers all throughout the day how they like this, what do they think of what we're doing, and it's just the same repeated refrain that they really like what we're doing, they like being involved with this, and they want to come back and do it again. And it's just a repeat. And the stories, like she said, the stories are so very important, because of the stories. I just made a 15-minute video for one of the grants that I'm working on. And it is so very important. And I tell stories about what we did. And if you give me the money to do what we do, then I will tell you what we did with it in the form of a story and how it affected somebody how we actually change their life. We step into their life for 9 hours, and when we leave them in a better shape. We leave them more healthy than they are than when we met them. And it's just the stories are so vitally important. They're all over the place. Just look. The stories are there.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Let's see, in the chat box, Philip was talking about space. He mentioned their building's fortunate to have a break room and a cafe for volunteers and a staff area. It makes them feel really a part of the team. And they're also working on a monthly gathering to talk about people's experiences serving and different motivations and goals. And then Mindy mentioned that they have a monthly email newsletter and they're trying to build a Facebook community for their volunteers. That's great. Anyone else want to share something about space for volunteers or stories? Kendra?
I'll share. Yeah. So I'm with Rebuilding Together Richmond, and we actually just came up with a short interview sheet to ask just some simple questions to our homeowners to get to know them a bit better. And these are very brief questions. We ask some things like, are they working? Or if they are retired, you know, what was it that you did do in the past? How long have you resided in this community? What are you excited about? The different type of repairs to your home. What are you excited about the volunteer work that's going to be done to your home? And so then we create like a short bio to present to our volunteer team captains, which they can share with the rest of their volunteer team. And I think that just creates a more personable experience. It makes them a lot more excited and makes it more impactful about the work that they're going to be doing.
That's awesome. I love that. Thanks for sharing. Would you be willing to share the interview sheet with us? If so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. If you could send it to me, I can share that with other folks here, since others might be interested in trying that out. That sounds great. All right, we are going to watch the last little section of the video, and then we will chat a bit again at the end here. There's the last two sections on symbols and growth and leadership.
Principle is symbols. Symbols are powerful tools in building community because they quickly remind us of our values, identity, and commitment as a community. Using symbols is a way to make communities stronger. Symbols represent these ideas and values, which is to say they often represent many things at once. There are lots of different ways that we can use symbolism and tokens. We tell our intention, tell the person tell the volunteer why we're giving it to them. We let them know what the symbolism represents to you and connect it to the future, how you hope it will support, change, or serve them. An example that I love to tell comes from a group of volunteers, animal welfare, animal rescue volunteers who were serving in Minot, North Dakota towards the end of a prolonged flood period a number of years ago. And they were the team that came to help the local shelter director who had been working 24/7, 7 days a week, 24/7, to manage this auxiliary shelter for all the families whose pets were not able to stay in their temporary housing with them when they lost their homes or while their homes were being addressed with the flood. And months into this final group that came helped her return or adopt out the final remaining pets, the unclaimed pets. And she was so grateful to these volunteers that she really wanted to do something very, very special. And she simply made a speech at their last night together and told them her intention. She said, I really struggled to find a way to express how much you all have meant to me and what your work has meant for our community. So the only thing I could do, symbolism, was give you this. And I hope it is a reminder to you, connection to the future, of what you mean to us and the difference that you've made for our community. And what did she hand them? She handed them each simply a roll of lifesavers. And I know that many of those volunteers have that roll of lifesavers even 10 years later, or however many years later, framed and in their office or in their home, because that's what it means to them. Finally, the seventh is leadership and growth. We all want to be valued and valuable. this desire is so powerful that we're rarely satisfied with these rungs on the ladder that we might already inhabit. We desire to move up in a scale of leadership in many cases, not all, but among volunteers, many do. They may start as a visitor and then, kind of a stick your toe in the water volunteer, or someone who's visiting your website to find out what volunteering might be like. Then they're a new volunteer, an experienced volunteer, and potentially a mentor or leadership volunteer. So what roles have you developed to be able to give volunteers the opportunity to move up in leadership? And part of that leadership can absolutely be a responsibility to help build community. In this landmark study back from 2009 that was commissioned by New York Cares, which is a large volunteer center in New York City, they identified a volunteer engagement scale, and I love this wording. Those visitors are more like shoppers, they call them, and then there's episodic contributors, short-term contributors, reliable regulars, all the way up to committed leaders as volunteers. The study looked at what correlated with volunteers moving up in that engagement scale. And what was the answer? It was those who believed that volunteering makes a difference in their community, those who enjoyed working with other volunteers, and those that were more satisfied with their team, with New York Cares. Those are all things that a team leader can help to nurture if those responsibilities are articulated, if it's clear in their position description, and they know that it's part of their responsibility. They're able to, if trained, to charged with this building of community, nurturing of community, volunteer leaders can really be pivotal in helping to nurture community and encourage retention and return volunteering. The interesting part of this study is that initial analysis indicated that team leaders in some cases were unwittingly contributing to decreased volunteer retention rates because they tended to focus more on getting the job done rather than engaging and inspiring volunteers to participate over the long term, focusing only on the impact of the work rather than the relationships between volunteers and the team. Once they shifted the training and the position descriptions for team leaders to incorporate this idea of community building, they were able to see much greater success in creating a sense of community, a more stable community, and a sustainable pipeline of volunteers returning over and over again. So again, I want to note that all 7 of these are not required, but I hope that you have some ideas of tactics and strategies, or which principles might make sense for you to reach that critical mass of practices that can continue to nurture and grow your volunteer community. And before we shift to questions, I'll just share these 4 key takeaways to try and sum up the last 45 minutes. Identify your volunteer engagement mission and values, and of course, articulate that and share it with volunteers and potential volunteers. Employ strategies to nurture community, such as clarifying the boundaries, incorporating some rituals, making sure that you're telling stories and finding opportunities to develop leaders within your volunteer community. Align your community building tactics with your values and mission. So for example, if diversity, equity, and inclusion is a new stated or reinforced goal at your organization and a value, then look at how your boundaries are really manifest. Are you truly open and accessible? You can have a boundary and still be very, very accessible. So I would look at your values and align these practices with them. And finally, empower volunteers to nurture community within their smaller groups and share that responsibility, frankly, as an opportunity to them. You shouldn't do this all yourself. It's not just on your shoulders, it's on the community to also help sustain itself. When you receive the PDF of the slides, or when you come back to the recording that you'll receive a link to, you can always check some of these really strong and useful resources. And I hope that you'll access them and use them. They're great resources. And with that, I'd love to thank you for participating and open it up for our community to participate. Jen,
We don't have Jen with us, so we're going to pause the recording there and come back together again just to debrief the ending here. It looks like I missed a couple of comments. I'm going to check those. Let's see, Mike said an idea to build stories around the volunteer community, ask volunteers and perhaps recipients to share a short phone video comment during their experience. Maybe offer a mug or some kind of gift for taking the time to submit that. I love that idea. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious if anybody has any ideas to share about how your organization uses symbols with volunteers, meaningful symbols. And I'd also love to hear about volunteer leadership. I don't know if any of you have kind of different names for the different types of volunteers you have as they are with you longer, or any sort of way to honor and recognize those who have been with your organization for a while. But anybody like to share about either symbols or leadership within volunteers? Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, we have some of our volunteer leaders that we call volunteer staff, because it really would be a staff role. They're just doing it without being paid. And we do keep track of volunteer hours. We have mostly individual volunteers. We do keep track of hours, and then we do special shirts for them, whether they're a 500-hour volunteer club or 1,000 hours. And so same look of the shirt, but you can really tell their number of hours. So they get additional comments when they're on a job site. So you can identify them as leadership.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else like to share? I have a few things to drop in the chat box for you. There were 3 different resources that were mentioned. There's the book, The Art of Community, which is what the webinar was based on. So there's that there. There's Zoom Connection Games, which is actually an ebook that you can get for free. If you click the link, you can sign up, and if you agree to be on their email list, which you can totally unsubscribe, you'll get a book of Zoom games you can play. And then the last one is called The Last Virtual Volunteering Guidebook, and that was actually written well before the pandemic, but it's gotten great reviews by people who've been using it during the pandemic. And so we're actually going to give away 1 copy of that last book called The Last Virtual Volunteering Guidebook to somebody who takes the survey of today's webinar. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat box right now to a survey. It's super short. We just want your feedback on this. And I have a couple of closing comments and things, but does anybody else want to share either about symbols or volunteer leadership, or really anything that came to your mind during this? If there's a takeaway for you, something you want to start doing in your organization or think about doing differently. Does anybody want to share something? Philip, go ahead.
Hi. So I really liked the language she used around like ritual, and it's sort of almost like anthropological, and thinking about us as nonprofits creating these spaces for people to gather and have these meaningful experiences, and really thinking about the steps in that. It was cool to have that different perspective.
Great. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else? Kendra?
Yeah, for me, I'll just say this was just very helpful. Like, I really enjoyed this. I'm over here and jotted so many ideas down thanks to this.
Great.
So I'm so excited. I feel like there's just so much room for growth, especially with the initiation and rituals that we talked about. So I'm excited.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it was so helpful for you. Let's see, Mindy coming in the chat box. It's important to offer a unique volunteer experience as much as possible and putting more time into the experience, not just the work. I think it is so easy just to get wrapped up into the repairs that need to get done. But I think Beth in this webinar really helped us see, the greater impact that we can have within the volunteer community. And of course, the better experience a volunteer has, the more likely they are to come back to help you repair more homes. Let's see here. We are just about out of time. I want to mention just a couple of things real quickly. We actually have another webinar tomorrow. It's a short one, about 45 minutes, and it's an informational webinar about a new program. We're starting a fundraising boot camp. And so if you'd like to learn more about that and meet the speakers who are going to be leading that, I'll drop a link in the chat box for that. Just a second here. Also, again, I wanted to thank Sterling Volunteers for allowing us to show this webinar to you all without having you guys sign up through them. Appreciate their generosity, and we will make sure that you get a link to not only our recording of this webinar, but also the full webinar. So if you want to catch the first 17 minutes that I didn't share, or their Q&A at the end, you can catch that on your own. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat box to the discounted background check information. So if your organization does background checks for volunteers and needs a better rate for them, it's worth looking at Sterling Volunteers for that. And let me just check my notes and see if there's anything else. There is a volunteer team building checklist that I will email all of you. It has a really, really long URL, so I'm going to drop it in the chat box, but it's going to look kind of crazy because it's really long. But I will also email it to you, so don't feel like you have to catch all these links before you go. I'm really grateful that you all came out today to share this hour with me. It's a hard hour of the day right after lunch. You get the afternoon slump, so I understand why a lot of you are off camera. That is totally fine. We would love your feedback on how this went, so I'm going to drop one last link again, and that is the survey about this webinar. And if you take 2 minutes to complete that, you'll get a chance to receive the volunteering book that we talked about. So with that, we will officially conclude. If anybody wants to stick around and chat for a few minutes with me, I will stay here, especially if you're not yet a member of the Coalition for Home Repair. I'd love to talk to you about membership. So if you have any questions about that, stick around. Otherwise, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day.